It's frequently claimed that the Gospels often contradict one another and that they therefore can't be reliable records. Well, in this video, we're going to look at some basic principles which generally resolve the issue of apparent contradictions in the Gospels. The problem is that there are places where the Gospels seem to make incompatible statements with one another. And people say, well, they can't both be true, so at least one of the Gospels must contain mistakes, therefore it's not reliable. Well, that isn't necessarily the case. There are a couple of principles we need to bear in mind. The first of them is that the Gospels are summaries. They are not absolute point-by-point records going on for every event over a long period of time. There's selection going on there. There is literary putting together of the accounts in ways that may not seem to be compatible with one another. Depends how they're summarized. And the other thing is that ancient writers use a different set of conventions from the conventions used in the modern world. And that means that sometimes what they say seems to us to be a little odd, and hence to lead to something that looks like a discrepancy in the Gospels. It isn't, it's just the way that ancient writers wrote. And with those principles, usually the contradictions disappear and you don't have to think about them at all. So let's think about this idea of the Gospels being summaries. The Gospels are summaries. It's very clear they're summaries. They cover things that lasted for a long time in only a small number of verses. There are extreme examples. Jesus on the cross, for example, he was on the cross for 6 hours. That's recorded in 22 verses in the Gospel of Matthew, 17 in Mark, 17 in Luke, and 13 in John. You can read those verses in a minute or so, but they record what happened over 6 hours. Now, that means that the writers had to choose particular bits to put in their account, and they didn't all choose the same bits, so therefore different things appear. Temptations in the wilderness are even longer. They took 40 days. Matthew records them in 11 verses. Mark, just 2 verses. Luke takes 13, and John, he doesn't record them at all. He just looks at what happens when Jesus returns. So again, 40 days, long time, more than a month, recorded in verses you can read in about a minute. Obviously, there is something of a contraction of the material. It's a summary of what's going on, and different writers summarize in different ways. So the same event can be written up quite differently by 2 different writers. Good example, suppose you've got 2 different newspaper accounts of the same football match. You've got a football match between Liverpool and Manchester United. The account in the Manchester Evening News is likely to be quite different from the account in the Liverpool Echo. And yet the match took place, and both of them will have a fairly accurate report of what actually happened. The famous account of the sinking of the Titanic says North Country man lost at sea. It's an extreme case, but and may even be apocryphal, but nevertheless, it's accurate. It's just that it's not what you'd normally think was going to be reported, the sinking of the Titanic. The other point is that there are ancient writing conventions. We're used to accounts being written in the order in which events happen. That isn't necessarily the case in ancient writing. Sometimes things are put in topical order. They're recorded by subject or by topic rather than by time. So if something starts, they'll then go on to finish that account before they move on to the next chronological thing after the start of that particular account. Here's an example of that, the account of the cursing of the fig tree. It appears in Matthew 21, and here you have Jesus walking by a fig tree. He sees that it's got leaves on it. He says it should have the beginnings of fruit. It doesn't. No one is going to get fruit from that tree. It's a waste of space. and he says, no fruit will ever come from you again, and the fig tree withers, and it looks as though it's happening at the same time. Now, in Mark, you get the same account of Jesus going past and cursing the fig tree. And then the next morning, as they go past the fig tree, they notice that it's withered away to its roots. Now, the question is, are those two incompatible? Well, no, it's a simple convention. Matthew is choosing to follow the subject. Mark is giving a chronological account. What happened one day, they go past in the morning, and then the next day they go past again, and they see the fig tree has withered away. The thing that worries people is that that's one day later. Matthew isn't, but it's just Matthew being topical. He's putting a similar material together in the same place. Now, some people say, hang on, it says it withered at once. Well, it withers pretty quickly. It should take, you'd expect, weeks for the fig tree to start to wither and then to finally wither away completely. But in one day, it's withered away to its roots. It's absolutely, completely withered away. Pretty fast for a tree. And Matthew notes that it happens suddenly. Mark also notes it happens suddenly, but Mark notes it because it's the next day and it's already withered right away to the roots. So there isn't a contradiction between them. It's just a difference in the way that the two gospel writers have chosen to write those particular ideas and events. Another one, the writers won't necessarily give you a complete list of everyone who's there or necessarily of every detail of an event. They'll pick the ones that are important for that writer and for that writer's particular purpose in writing that particular document. Might ignore other people or other events. And the example that's often given, which women went to visit the tomb of Jesus. And the point is that there were several different women that went. Different gospels record different ones, but all of them say there were several women. Among them were, and Matthew says Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and he includes Salome as well. Matthew wasn't interested in Salome. Luke, well, Luke doesn't actually list them at the time. He says other women went, various women went, and then later on he says the ones that went to tell the disciples were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, we've got her again, and Joanna, a different one that Luke's particularly concerned with for various reasons, and he says, and there were others as well. And John talks about Mary Magdalene alone, but it's a John's eye view. John sees Mary Magdalene go off the tomb, he sees her come back again, and in verse 2, she says, they have stolen the Lord's body, we don't know where he's gone. We don't know. So it's implying there are other women there as well. John has chosen just to record Mary Magdalene. So the fact that different writers record different women going to the cross isn't a problem, because there were lots of women that went to the cross, or at least more than just one or two, and the gospel writers have chosen to record the ones by name, the ones that they are particularly interested in, maybe the ones that their audience actually knew about. Another one, telescoping. Here, what happens is you write as though it was one continuous narrative, two events at different times. They get pushed together because they make one story. So here we have Jesus. There's a record of the day of resurrection. Jesus talks to them. The disciples, that is, he talks to them in the upper room, and at the end of the account we get verse 49. He says, but I'm setting the promise of my Father on you, and stay in the city, means Jerusalem, until you're clothed with power from on high. And that appears to be on the day of the resurrection, but in Matthew's gospel we find that the 11 disciples went to Galilee, and there they see Jesus. They then have to return to Jerusalem. So did they stay in Jerusalem or did they go to Galilee? Well, they went to Galilee. The point is that Luke is telling us that at some point later, and it is later, Jesus tells them to stay in Jerusalem. He's probably talking about that straight before he was ascended to heaven. Luke knew this. He knew that it was 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, because he writes it in Acts. In Luke, it sounds as though it was all the same day. It's just the way Luke writes. It's a convention. He's using this telescoping convention to put things together. He knows what he's talking about, though. Other issues you get in there, different people see different things. So the same event, but looked at from different points of view, give you different results. So you might end up with two different people giving fairly different descriptions of the same event. For example, the resurrection appearances, again, we know from Luke's gospel that at least three women, well, we know his mother, it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and it says the other woman with them. So there were some women, including those three. But in Mark, we've got an account from a different person, a completely different woman. Women that were with her, the women that they go from different places, starting points, they meet together, they go to visit the tomb, and then some of them go off to tell the disciples, some of them don't. And one of the groups, at least, that didn't is the one that Mark's talking about. That group went back to their home and didn't say anything. A different group went off to tell the disciples what they'd seen. Different groups. That's all it is. Not a contradiction at all. So different women say different things. They saw different things. They had different experiences, and they tell us what they saw. And the last thing, of course, is that quite often you find that two different events are recorded, and of course they have different details. Sometimes there are more than two similar events. For example, Jesus' teaching, known as the Sermon on the Mount, the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, differs slightly from an account in Luke, which is a bit similar, except that Luke's account is a sermon in a plain, it's not on the mountain. Probably Jesus did the same kind of teaching. He went to a new town and gave the same teaching there, and went to another town and did the same teaching there, and so on. And Matthew and Luke are reporting on fairly different accounts. Just to add to the interest there, of course, the teaching took a long time. Both Matthew and Luke are summarizing. Matthew may be doing the ancient thing of adding in other things that are on the same topic. So we may get a slightly more nuanced picture of what's going on. It's not just that someone sat there and took shorthand and took two different accounts came out of that, different events, different things were said. There are two different occasions where Jesus overthrew money changers in the temple, one at the beginning of his ministry, one at the end of his ministry, and the two of them have slight differences in detail. There are three different occasions where a woman anointed Jesus with ointment or perfume. One of them is in Galilee or on the edge, or the southern edge of Galilee. Two of them are in Bethany. They have different details because they are different accounts and different events, possibly copycat, but nonetheless they are different events. And, well, we just mentioned the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. One of the occasions that's often described as being a contradiction is, what were the last words of Jesus on the cross? Well, I hope you can see the problem with that. Mark, well, the last words he records exactly are, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Luke records a different set of words as the last recorded words. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, cried out with a loud voice. And the question that gets asked is, what were Jesus' last words? And it's suggested from Mark suggests that he died in despair, not knowing why he was dying, what was the purpose of his death. Whereas in Luke, he dies at some kind of peace with God. But rubbish. First of all, the words we got in Mark aren't actually Jesus' last utterance. He said something afterwards, just that the words don't happen to record it in Mark. Mark has chosen to record, my God, why have you forsaken me? It doesn't mean they were the last words. It just means they're the last words that Mark chose to end his account on. Jesus didn't die in despair, not knowing what was happening to him. He'd already taught. There you are, Mark chapter 8, rather earlier, about nearly a year earlier. Jesus is already teaching his disciples he's going to go to Jerusalem and be killed, and then after 3 days rise again. So Jesus knows what's happening, and Mark says that. So that the contradiction disappears. It isn't there. There isn't one. All it is a difference in selection between Mark and Luke as to what sayings of Jesus they're going to record. We've got 7 different sayings recorded. There may be even more than that. All we know is that 7 are recorded. So this contradiction actually manufactured there to try and cast doubt on the Gospels, but it's not really a contradiction at all, and you have to think about it for a short while to realize that. Another one that's often brought up, the genealogies of Jesus. Jesus has 2 different genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke. And they're different. When you look at them, they're different. They don't agree after the time of David, with possible convergence at the time of Zerubbabel, although there could have been more than one person with that name. So they're different genealogies. And the question is, are they both wrong then, or one of them wrong? Or could there actually be more than one line of descent for Jesus? Do people ever have 2 different lines of descent? Well, one family where the genealogy is particularly well recorded, of course, is the British royal family. And if you look at the line of descent between Charles III, the current king, and Queen Victoria, you find there are 2 different lines of descent for Charles III from Queen Victoria. That's only a few generations ago. 5 generations, I think. And yet there are 2 parallel lines of descent. Going back 1,000 years to William the Conqueror, the same sort of time between Jesus and David the King, then there are liable to be many different lines of descent. There are at least 2 different lines of descent between Queen Elizabeth II and William the Conqueror. So that gives 3 for Charles III. There are probably others as well, given how long ago it was and how many descendants there are of William the Conqueror. So we mustn't be surprised if there is more than one line of descent between David and Jesus. So could there be 2 parallel lines of descent? Well, it's perfectly feasible. In fact, it's more than feasible. It's very likely there'd be more than one line of descent. There might have been 3, 4, 5 different lines of descent. We just don't know about any of the others. So let's conclude what we're talking about. First point is that actually when you look at the Gospels, when you apply very simple principles to comparing them, you see that there aren't any significant contradictions in the Gospels at all. And the discrepancies that appear, they're just apparent discrepancies, they're not real, are there because the Gospels are summaries. Detail appears in one Gospel but not in another. Different writers write differently. And another point that you often get, we'll come across that if there's another video, which I'm going to record in a moment, says often in real life situations are quite confused, all sorts of things are going on, and the witness notices a few of them and writes those down. They appear to be at odds with something else that's happening just because of the general confusion of the real life situation. And of course, there's this fact that ancient writers use just different conventions from modern ones. If we read them with modern conventions, we end up with slight confusion. So, I hope you liked that video. If you did like that video, there's a button that YouTube provides for you very conveniently that you can click on and tell us that you like it. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed it and get more videos of the same kind on this channel. So, may God bless you in your studies.